So yes, Alpina has been around since 1965, and yes, Alpina is still a family-run company that is independent of BMW. In fact, it is still run by 2 generations of that family. Yet for me, they take me back to 80s era BMWs, back in the day when very few people had serial production BMWs, even fewer had the forbidden fruit that were gray market import Alpina BMWs with manual transmissions. But fast forward to today, and if we're being frank with one another, most people have BMWs, but one thing hasn't changed. Very few people have Alpinas, which is why we need to drive one today. It is entirely understandable for one to confuse this 4.4 twin-turbo V8 with the ones we've been driving in many BMW M cars, as well as non-BMW M cars that have V8s. However, that really couldn't be further from the truth, because what the Alpina engineers do is they take this engine as a foundation, and the only way to describe it is they create their own art with it. Here are some examples. Number one, the turbochargers. They rip the BMW impellers out. Then they come in with their own bigger impellers. They're 54 millimeters in diameter. Then they rip out the engine control management system, and they do their own mapping, like throttle mapping, that kind of stuff. And then one of the bigger changes is the cooling system, and here are some great examples of that. Number one, there's an external water cooler. There's an external transmission oil cooler. Then there's the intercoolers, and this is probably the biggest change. Here, they're bigger, and they've changed the placement of them, so there's less distance for the air to travel to the turbochargers. They're higher capacity. Okay, now that we got all the pedantic details out of the way and we know we're dealing with a heavily modified engine, what does it translate to in terms of output? Well, that's 600 horsepower that comes in at 5,500 RPM, stays flat all the way up to 6,500 RPM, and the torque 590 pound-feet that comes in at 2,000 RPM, stays flat all the way up to 5,000 RPM. Then there are the performance figures, but I need to remind you, what you are looking at is a 4,855 pound vehicle. Depending on how you express your weights and measures, 2,202 kilograms, 0 to 60, 3.5 seconds. And I'd like to point out that the wheelbase of this vehicle is 126 inches long, and VMAX is still 205 miles an hour. I would be lying to you if I told you I was not just a little bit more excited about what you and I are going to do now. Holy crap, 3,000 RPM, this thing comes alive. The folks at Alpina know how to tune a big engine in a big car. If you putter around town with this engine somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 RPM, it's kind of a luxury car. But you put your foot into this thing, the power delivery is fantastic. I don't normally say this with BMWs, but there's a raw power to this Alpina tune to the engine over the standard 8-cylinder in the 7 Series, and it is good. You will not be surprised to learn that the engine is but only one change in going from a box standard 7 Series to a B7. Like the engine, the Alpina engineers use the rest of the car as a foundation and then reason up from there. So a bit of a recap: all-wheel drive BMW 7 Series, 2-chamber air ride all the way around, and then the Alpina engineers go in and they create their own tune of sorts. They do this by completely remapping the dampers, and a great example of this is if the car is in Sport Plus or over 140 miles an hour, it can lower the ride height by 0.6 of an inch. They can do this trick in reverse, and there's a very specific reason they do that. You look at the front of the car, it has a stunning air dam on it, and that thing is very necessary because it kind of rights the wrong of that huge schnoz that BMW put on the car in 2020. Now the front of the car is right-sized, but you will notice the air dam is very low, and it could be very expensive to fix if you hit it. So you could adjust the ride height higher by 0.8 of an inch. Only catch, up to 20 miles an hour. And then, continuing the theme of everything is more interesting in the world of Alpina, the wheels and tires. Now, there is a 20-inch wheel fitted as standard. For the avoidance of doubt, this one is the optional 21-inch wheel. But with the 20-inch wheels, one can select an all-season tire. However, every other tire choice is a non-run flat tire. You and I don't see that nowadays. Then the wheels themselves. Notice the density of the spokes here. That enables them to use less aluminum, which they do this in-house to create these wheels, and that lowers the unsprung weight of the wheels by 20%. Okay, enough of the suspension. Let's press onto the exhaust. There, a couple of things jump out at you. Surprise, surprise, it is specific to the B7. Then it is constructed of stainless steel, which lowers the overall weight. And then the way it's plumbed underneath the car, it reduces the back pressure. Then the design at the rear, the tailpipes themselves are elliptical and they go through the bumper and they're chrome finish. Very nice touch. And then, of course, there are adjustable baffles. So depending on the mode you're driving in, it can impact the sound. We will talk more about that later. And then there are the brakes. They are not a huge change from the standard uprated brakes of the 7 Series. 15.5-inch diameter rotors in the front with 4 piston calipers. Then in the rear, floating calipers, but very odd, the rotors are bigger in the rear than in the front. They're 15.67 inches. And then last but not least, the transmission. Here, once again, they use the BMW unit as a foundation. That comes from ZF. We've driven it in many other BMWs. It does have a torque converter, so it's not a dual clutch. But what the Alpina engineers do is a couple of things. Number one, they remap the transmission. Number two, they reinforce both the planetary gear set as well as the torque converter. And number three, the gear ratios are closer together. The two things that just jump out the most is less pitch and there's less dive in the front. Generally with very large cars like this, when you try to push them through turns, they can't control the weight, so it tends to plow through the corner. Here, all of those bad manners have been cleaned up in the transition to the Alpina B7. You and I are at the point of the episode where we need to discuss two theories. One I don't think exists yet, and that would be, if you're going to go fast, why not do it in style? And apparently someone at Alpina got the memo, and there's a couple of points that really underscore that theory. Number one, the leather at the top here as well as on the dash called Lavalina. Then there's a choice. One can either have piano black here as trim, which I think is a complete crime in a car like this when there is this wood on offer. Now, if I were to tell you wood that is shiny, that has like an orangey red tint to it, you would think I'm nuts. But when you see it in person, Santa Maria, Madre de Dios, does it stand out? The only complaint I have, can we do a satin finish version of that? And that would bring us to our next theory, which I am a huge believer in, and that would be don't let them see you coming. Great example. If I were to get Kumo an E63 S-Wagon, the first thing I would do on the order sheet is to delete the badging on the back of the car. Here is the opposite, a case that can be made for maybe you let them see it once they're in the car. There's this very subtle badging that is understated, as well as one plaque on the center console that says what this car is. Even down to the floor mats, there are these small Alpina logos that almost look like antique coins. And then last but not least, there are a couple of items not as readily apparent. For example, the graphics within the gauge cluster, very similar to what's in a box standard 7 Series. But what Alpina does, they change the graphics to use more of their specific Alpina blue in their representation of the graphical gauges in a B7. The steering wheel is different. However, they do something that's very strange, and that is take out the paddle shifters that come from BMW, and they put these buttons, these, I don't know what they call them, tap shift, but they're buttons, they're not paddle shift. You can see the plus here and the minus here on the top of the steering wheel, and they're these small buttons, almost reminiscent of the radio controls in a Chrysler, actually a little bit smaller than that. And here's where I'd like to make a suggestion to the man in charge at Alpina. Can we go to paddles? But unlike the paddles from BMW, can we mount them to the steering column, make them a bit bigger, probably do some pageantry like you do to the rest of the interior, kind of like GTRs used to do? That would be wunderbar. Yes, it is indeed that time again to play your favorite game, Mind the Options game, with a first-time ever contestant, an Alpina. This one, a 2020 Alpina B7 for a base price of $142,800. Now, as a basis of comparison, the most basic 7 Series is a paltry $86,450. The most fancy BMW 7 Series, a 760, $157,700. Now, another point of information, B7s have a lot of bits fitted as standard that are optional in a lesser 7 Series. Things like a head-up display, the ceramic controls inside the car, Apple CarPlay, and most importantly, four-wheel steering. Now, the color. If I had seen this car years ago, I would have never thought of Alpina blue. But really, this is the first time I'm seeing Alpina green metallic in person. It is so striking, one would say, auf Wiedersehen, Alpina Blau. The interior is ivory white with a black Napa two-tone. Then the rear seats, it's a luxury rear seat package that adds ventilated seats in the rear, heated seats in the rear, massage seats in the rear, and heated armrests for $3,900. Then probably the most important option on this car is the 21-inch classic Alpina wheels, which forces the non-run flat tire for $1,300. May I say, makes the car look wunderbar. Then the panoramic Sky Lounge LED roof. This isn't the sunroof, it's the lighted LEDs in the roof for $900. Then the adaptive LED laser light headlights. No, these are not the trick laser headlights that are legal in Europe, not legal in the US, but they are much cheaper than a Porsche at $1,000. Then the drive recorder, the thing you would use in like Moscow, that's an additional $200. And then the Bowers and Wilkins stereo. I would like to point out that the Harman Kardon sound system is fitted as standard in B7s, but you don't want that. You're already getting an almost $150,000 car. You need Bowers & Wilkins. It kicks $3,400. Then you just add the destination handling for $995 for a total retail price of $154,495. So for the majority of this episode, you and I have been driving this car in Sport Plus mode, for obvious reasons. However, I have backed down to comfort mode to demonstrate something very important with the Alpina. This is full tap in comfort mode. And notice, you really don't hear much. And I completely get it. It's supposed to sound that way for a very specific reason. However, let's go back into Sport Plus, open the taps again. And there is a growl to this thing, there is a bark to this thing. It is unlike other BMWs. This is one of the bits that make this car stand out over other 7 Series, I would argue over other BMWs. And I gotta say, I like this thing a lot. Yes, absolutely the wrong language, yet there is a certain je ne sais quoi about this that makes it stand out to me above and beyond the power delivery, the suspension setup, the stunning interior, the incredible Alpina green finish, and even the fact, soup to nuts, beyond B7s, Alpina worldwide production is something like 1,800 units annually. Put all of that together and then some, I may even say no to an S-Class AMG and would have an incredibly hard time saying no to a Porsche Panamera. That is where I turn this around to you guys. If you had to choose the S-Class AMG, Porsche Panamera, let's say the Turbo, or the B7, which one would you choose? Why would you choose it? And most importantly, which color would you choose? Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all one word, MotoManTV all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, now the correct language. Bis später.